Okay, welcome to this webinar of the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Uri Dromi, Director General of the club. And today we are pleased to host again Dana Weiss, anchor woman and attorney. Dana is the host of Saturday Night News and the political and diplomatic correspondent for the Israel Channel 12. Dana, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
In the past, we used to ridicule Italy for its political instability. If you remember, they had 68 different governments in 74 years. But recently, Israel seems to be breaking a record with 4 elections in 2 years. What's going on here? Is there a problem with the system, or, as many claim, is it all about Netanyahu trying to get away from his trial?
Well, I think that after doing this for quite a while and, giving analysis for 4 elections, which we didn't see coming, we have to be humble in our answers. It's a good idea also in face of the pandemic, but I think the simple answer, and I think the correct answer, is that it's not about the system, because we just before we got into this spin of elections in November 2019, Netanyahu's government was a very stable 4 years government. We haven't had that long a government of quite a while, and Netanyahu himself has has become the longest serving prime minister, even more than David Ben-Gurion, the founder of this country. So it's not about the system. It is about Netanyahu being in power, Netanyahu having to deal with his legal issues and the law allowing him to stay prime minister. And it is about the fact that the key players have all personal issues with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And for instance, I think Victor Lieberman, who was the kingsmaker for the 3 rounds, now he's not going to be the kingsmaker anymore, but he was the kingsmaker. And he was actually the one who brought us, who stopped the alliance with Netanyahu. He's the first to admit that for him, it's personal. He wants to see Netanyahu and his coalition with the Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties out. That is his goal. And even if it means that he's going to forfeit all his personal, ambitions, whatever, this is the issue. So at the end of the day, I think the simple answer to your complicated question is yes, it is about Netanyahu. Because again, today, the only question we ask every time we see the polls is, does Netanyahu have 61 seats? Does he have that majority that he needs, not in order to pursue his agenda, because his diplomatic, his economic agenda, he's pursuing in any way. It's just about, does he have a way out of his legal issues? And to get out of his legal issues, he needs the majority of 61 seats. So again, the only question we're asking in this round is no different than the one we asked before.
So we had 3 elections in the last 2 years, and nothing seems to have changed. There are 2 main blocks, center right and center left, with little shifts from one to another. So how can things be different after a 4th election?
Well, I think these elections are very different than the previous ones, because for Netanyahu, the best scenario is left, right. I am the leader of the right, and it's your choice, dear voters, is, God forbid, a general from Benny Gantz who served in the army, okay? And in no means is left, in no means is he left, but I can say that he's left, therefore he's weak, therefore you shouldn't rely on him. And there's me, the right bloc and the left bloc. That was true when we had this big blue and white party for 3 rounds, which managed to get at least 35 seats, 33, 35 seats, depending on what round. These elections are totally different. A, because Netanyahu, who is the best chess player in the region and the best, I would say the most shrewd and ruthless politician in Israel, and sees many steps ahead from any of his competitors, managed to dismantle this blue and white opposition. So he has left the center left in shatters, but for the first time, the real threat for Netanyahu is not from a big center party on the center or center left, but it is in the right bloc. It's the first time that Netanyahu is faced with his nightmare, because he was always, you would say Netanyahu, you would say right, you would say Mr. Security. For the first time, there are two people who have started their career with Prime Minister Netanyahu. They know him very well. They served under him in his government, and they are right. And they stand up and they say, we are, head to toes.
You're talking Sar and Bennett.
Yes, head to toes right. I'm talking about Naftali Bennett, who was the former defense minister, and he led the party which the traditional light Orthodox party, which are very much affiliated with the settlers, the right, the greater Israel perspective. So he is totally right. No one can think that Naftali Bennett is center. Okay, you can't say, oh, look at him, he's a lefty. It won't stick to him. And the second person is Gideon Sa'ar, who was served as the cabinet secretary for Netanyahu in his government, and later on served as an internal affairs minister, and education minister, and actually the only person who challenged Netanyahu's leadership in the Likud party, and tried to, in the primaries for the head of the Likud. And he's also come up with a very right-wing party. And what they're saying is, it's not about the political agenda. It's not about settlement. It's not about where you put your embassy in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv. It's not about that. It's just about values. It's about how you treat democracy, how you treat courts, how you treat what is a very important phrase in Israel. It's called mamlachti. Do you put the country before your politics? Where is your loyalty? What will you do in order to stay in power? And I think in a way, it's a lot about the argument that we heard in the United States, Trump versus Biden, whereas Biden is no means a lefty, but he was the person who says, I put my country first. I put democracy first. I put what is supposed to be, what is expected from a politician, what we know from a politician. So here Netanyahu is faced with two people who are, right. He can't say, leave them alone, they're lefties, but they're coming and saying, look, Netanyahu has to go, not because he is good, but because he's serving too long. There's a danger in serving too long. And B, he doesn't know how to manage this pandemic. He has no managing skills because he has to let his coalition partners, the ultra-religious, do what they want because he needs their 61 votes to take care of his personal issues. And C, enough is enough. Gideon Sa'ar is saying, I will not sit with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I am right, but I think, I'm a right wing, but I think it's time for Netanyahu to go, and I will not sit with him. Naftali Bennett is playing a different game. He's saying, well, I'm not going to play in this game, yes, Bibi, or no, Bibi. I'm telling you, he doesn't know how to treat the pandemic. He doesn't know how to treat economy. He doesn't know how to do things. He has to go. He's been there too long. He's taking care of his personal issues. But I'm not going to tell you if I'm going to sit with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So people who vote for Naftali Bennett don't know at the end of the day, are they actually voting for Prime Minister Netanyahu? People who vote for Gideon Sa'ar know that no matter what, if they want to change, if they want to see change, if they want to see Prime Minister Netanyahu out and someone else in, they can vote for Gideon Sa'ar. In this way, Gideon Sa'ar is trying to catch voters from the center who are what we call in Israel strategic voters. It's amazing. They're about out of 120 mandates, about 6 to 8 mandates of voters in Israel who actually vote not upon their ideology, or if there's anything of that left in this yes Bibi or no Bibi era, but they vote as in a strategic way. They don't know, they're undecided, and then they wake up like a week before the ballots are open, and they say, okay, if my number one goal is to get Netanyahu out of office because A, B, C, D, then who can help me achieve this goal? Now, if I know, for example, that Gideon Sa'ar is a right-wing party, but he's, he respects the rule of law, he's against corruption, we count on him, he seems okay, despite the fact that he's right. He said he won't sit with Netanyahu, so maybe we give him our vote, although we might, think we're labor parties, but he can do the job. So Sa'ar can enjoy this 6 to 8 mandates where Naftali Bennett can't, because he's not willing to say in advance, I'm not going to sit with Netanyahu. So this elections, Uri, and your questions are very different because it's a big challenge for Netanyahu from the right. He hasn't had that before. It was always Netanyahu was king of the right. He could attack the center left.
But I wonder why you said before that Lieberman is not the kingmaker anymore. We have a right-wing or pro-Bibi bloc of 54, I would say, and the center-left or anti-Bibi of 58, and Lieberman is still there with his 8 mandates, so he's still a kingmaker.
No, he's not a kingmaker because he's part of the anti-Bibi bloc. He was very clear in saying, I'm not going to sit with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I'm not going to sit with the Haredim. So in that sense, in the first round, he was actually the kingsmaker because he didn't say in advance if he's going to sit with Netanyahu or he's going to sit with Kahol Lavan, with Gantz, with the blue and white party. And the reason we went to a second round was because he wouldn't decide. He wouldn't choose sides. Then we went into the second round of elections. The third round of elections was, he again didn't choose a side. But this time he's very clear in saying, I'm with the anti-Bibi camp. So he's in that, his seats are counted over there. So the kingsmaker, actually, the new kingsmaker is Naftali Bennett, because he's not saying in advance. Now, if you ask me what Naftali Bennett will do at the end of the day.
Yeah, I do, I ask you.
I think Naftali Bennett for many years, if you would talk to Naftali Bennett, he would say, look, I know Netanyahu has a lot of flaws, but at the end of the day, I trust him when it comes to security. I trust him when it comes to, making the right decision for the country. He's not saying that anymore in private conversations. So I think if there would be an option, if Netanyahu doesn't have 61 without Bennett, or he doesn't have, let's say, 57 without Bennett or 59 without Bennett, Bennett would prefer to go with the others and get Netanyahu out of the way, because Bennett wants to be prime minister. So no one of them has an interest to allow Prime Minister Netanyahu to stay in office, because they understand that once Netanyahu stays in office this time, he's going to make sure that the court disappears. He'll change whatever law he needs to stay in power indefinitely. So Bennett has an interest to get rid of Netanyahu, but he also understands that for his voters, it's very hard mentally to understand that they're going to put in place, let's say, a government with Lapid. So only if he has a chance to have a government with Gideon Sa'ar first, and him maybe in rotation or whatever, he'll do that. So again, he's the kingsmaker. And I would say that he's an opportunist in the sense that if it's in his interest to sit with Netanyahu, he'll find a way. But it's not his first preference. His first preference is to see Netanyahu out, and that opens the way for him. But if the constellation in some way will be that that Netanyahu is close to a government or has a government without him, he will sit with him.
You mentioned all the reasons why Netanyahu should go. He ruled us for too long. He failed in handling the coronavirus crisis. His trial has just started, but his base seems to be very solid. What is the secret here? Is this a politics of identities, or people who feel threatened around him, or what?
I think it's all of the above, and I think we have a lot of parallels to the United States, because at the end of the day, President Trump got 74 million votes, right? So you could say that 10 million votes of these voters are reflect the people we saw on Capitol Hill, storming the Capitol Hill, but the rest are normal Americans who feel I think it's politics of identities. They feel that for all the right reasons. I can't say it would be wrong to disregard Netanyahu's voters. And I think a lot of them see the good he's done in 10 years. I think a lot of them had a very big increase in the quality of their life. They had a lot of security. It's true that the pandemic has changed that. It's true that for the first time, Netanyahu is not only faced with two rivals from the right, but also facing this magnitude of a crisis. He's managed to rule, to be in office for 10 years without having any war, without any serious security issues. We had some operations in the south, but they weren't anything resembling the intifadas and the sense of security crisis that we had. So the first time, it's this national crisis. So it's going to be very tricky for him. I think that it would be true to say, and I think he said that in a close conversation that was leaked. He said his fate is in the hands of the coronavirus. And I think also in the United States, at the end of the day, Trump lost the elections because of the coronavirus. So in that, I see a lot of resemblance to the United States.
Let's talk about Yair Lapid for a second. He positioned himself as a contender, as a pretender to be prime minister. But it seems that there's some glass ceiling about him, and this is his perceived qualification to be a prime minister. Saar and Bennett, when it comes to the question who's more fit to be prime minister, are ahead of him. And also we just saw the demise of the generals in politics. Benny Gantz, of course, Ashkenazi, Yalon, Huldai. Do you see a change here? Maybe a more civic form of prime ministers?
Those are two good questions. Let me start with Yair Lapid. There's the political spin doctors in Israel have this observation, which is right, that Naftali Bennett always succeeds too early, and Yair Lapid is always the one surprising on the day of election. And I think it's true, because when we started, Naftali Bennett had 20 seats in the polls, and he was the next prime minister and whatever. And then you'll see, he's going to have a hard time. He might even drop under the 10 mandates. It's always the pattern with Naftali Bennett. And Yair Lapid is always the one to surprise the pollsters, because I think it will happen again, because I'm looking at the voters of the center left, and they're left without one big party that they can go to. The Labor has declined and is not it used to be the traditional, there was Labor and Likud. Now they're a very small party with a very interesting new leader that was elected, Merav Michaeli. But they're more of a lefty group, just like Meretz. So they're not this establishment of this big, great party that they used to be. So and Huldai hasn't succeeded. So it's all been shattered. There hasn't been one big party. So Yair Lapid is there, and he's the only person who's been around and has been consistent and has stayed loyal to his word. So I believe at the end of the day, Yair Lapid will surprise. And for Netanyahu, Netanyahu just released yesterday yesterday a new ad for Netanyahu. That is, he wants Yair Lapid to be strong, and he wants Yair to be the alternative because it's good for him that he can go back to Yair Lapid from this weak left center and me strong from the right. So Netanyahu is not talking about Bennett, and he's not talking about Gideon Sa'ar. He's not even mentioning them in his ads because he understands that's where his danger is. So he's going to the easy target, Yair Lapid. But in a sense, it's good for Yair Lapid because it builds him as the alternative. So for Yair Lapid, it's good because it builds him for the alternative. For Netanyahu, it's good because he doesn't have to deal with the threat on the right. So I think at the end of the day, Yair Lapid will have a payoff for his for staying on track, staying focused on his message, not breaking his promise to the voters not to sit with Netanyahu while the others general did. And that brings me to the general question. I think it's it. I mean, Benny Gantz is a good person, and he's devoted his life to the security of Israel. And Gabi Ashkenazi, again, devoted his life to the security of Israel. And so was Bogi and all the generals. Two things. It's much easier to be a general and where everyone has to obey your commands than to be a CEO of a company, head of a school, a manager, and a politician, where you have to convince people to do things and you can't order them. So I think there is a lot of being a general that is just not fit for civil society, and we see it time and again. And especially for Benny Gantz and Ashkenazi, Benny Gantz still calls Netanyahu prime minister. Now, this guy, Bibi, has done to Benny Gantz, I mean, unbelievable. He broke every promise. He treated him with disrespect. Now he's blaming him of the death of 5,000, victims of the coronavirus, whatever. It's just appalling the way Netanyahu, the person, treated Benny Gantz, the person, despite the fact that Benny Gantz was willing to believe him. And yet again, he sits in cabinet and calls him prime minister because there's this sense of duty of a soldier, of an officer that doesn't understand that he's in a total different playground. And I think at the end of the day, you have to understand that politics is very different than serving in the army. And not a very good general necessary is a good politician. That when you're a politician, you have to stay loyal to a set of values, to ideology. And it's not just about serving your country. That's not enough. It's a starter, but it's not enough to be a politician. There has to be a vision. There has to be an inner belief of an agenda, of an ideology that you want to serve. And I think that's where they fall. And it's interesting that the former head of Chief of Staff, Eisenkot, the last one who has just come out of the army and was supposed to be the next big promising general, understood that and decided not to jump into politics at this time.
People call Netanyahu the magician. Look how he consolidated the right-wing bloc and almost dissolved the center or put it in the disarray, the center-left bloc. Is there a secret card he can still pull out of his sleeve at the last moment? Perhaps.
I think he already pulled three very important cards. By getting Benny Gantz to sit with him in this coalition government,
okay,
he dismantled the opposition of this blue and white big party, which was a big threat to him. No big alternative on the left, center left, and we just talked about the liabilities of Yair Lapid. B, he managed to do something very important. He secured the ultra right and made sure that the ultra right would sit together and they would pass the threshold. Otherwise, he would have lost those votes. He needs those 4 seats to get to 61. He managed to do that. It's again, he managed to take all these, really racist Kahana leaders to sit with the right wing of the ultra religious. Doesn't matter. He has Smotrich and Ben Gvir together, he secured that side. And he's done a third thing, which is amazing. And he has managed to tear apart the coalition of Arab politicians that managed to make the Arab vote so significant in these past elections. The Joint Arab Move Party managed to get 15 seats because they were a bloc that ran together. Okay. By the way, it's interesting that the reason for this bloc was Lieberman. Never mind. So they ran and they managed, and in Israel, the more you raise the vote of the Arabs, of course, the magnitude of the right comes down. What he did, and actually, the reason we went from election round 1 to election round 3 in the second time was the fact that he managed to make it unloyal in a way for leaders to go ahead and join hands with the Arab politicians in order to form a 61 government, okay?
Which he does now,
And then this time, he's running, I'm sure you remember in 2015, the video clip he did on the elections day where he said that the Arabs were moving in scorns in buses to the ballots. We have to save Israel from the Arabs, okay? This time, he's spending more time in Arab cities and Arab villages and talking to Arab votes, and he even added to the list for the first time an Arab that he gave him as a place in the list without even going through the primaries, because he understands that there is a small sector of Arabs who are actually, in a way, a mirror of the ultra-Orthodox that he has in the government, the Jewish ultra-Orthodox. They're anti-gay and anti-liberal and whatever. They're very religious, Muslim religious. And now all of a sudden he's their best friend, and their leader is saying, well, you know what? I can go along with Netanyahu. So he managed to also break that block in the wall against the anti-Bibi wall. So he's done three very important things which earn him the politician magician that he is.
Except that it seems, according to the recent polls, that this is not enough. So my question is, will he, in your assessment, pull out of his sleeve another card, let's say peace with Saudi Arabia, a bold move against Iran, or what?
Well, the thing is that he doesn't have his friend in the White House anymore. I'm reminding you that President Biden hasn't even called him. So before, in the past 3 elections, we knew that we were on the jet towards Washington before every election, because the big friend, the best friend in the White House would do whatever he needed for him to be elected. It was the declaration of the Golan Heights. Now I hear that Biden is questioning it and thinking it over. And then we went for the Abraham Accords, and then we went for the Trump-Peace Treaty. We knew that before elections in Jerusalem, we'd have to go to Washington, because he had this great ally in the White House who actually was very active in making sure that Netanyahu stayed in office, just as Netanyahu was on Team Trump. Trump was on Team Netanyahu very clearly. I remember that Friedman, the ambassador, the previous ambassador, U.S. ambassador in Israel, said, in a briefing to us, yes, we think that Netanyahu is the prime minister who is best for Israel and who's best for our interests, and we'll do whatever we need to make sure that he stays in office. This is not the case anymore. Netanyahu can't pull out of his sleeve something that will make him this great leader. Remember that in the last elections, the billboards were of Netanyahu shaking hands with Trump, and it said, Netanyahu, a leader from another league, meaning, I am not, I am best friends with the strongest leader in the world, okay? He can't hang those signposts anymore, right? So it's not going to be there. What Netanyahu has to do are 2 things. A, he's going to hope that the shatters of the parties in the center-left will take a price, and one of them won't pass the threshold. So therefore, a lot of votes going down the drain. He's going to have to make sure that the fact that he managed to crumble the Arab partnership, political partnership, will lose votes over there, and he has to make sure that the ultra right get into the Knesset. And he has to find a way to try and live up to his promises that it's just another 2 weeks of lockdown and we're going to celebrate. And I was the man who brought the vaccines and look what change it did. And look how I managed to treat the coronavirus and now we're living as I promised you. It's not going to happen. So what he's done in the recent days is he's starting to blame Benny Gantz for the situation. He's going, and voters will have to decide, do they believe that Netanyahu was the one who brought them vaccinations and does everything right, and it's because Benny Gantz that the situation is as it is, or they will find an alternative. But at the end of the day, Netanyahu's fate in the coming 6 weeks is about the coronavirus and about will he manage to stick with the narrative of me bringing the vaccination, me bringing the solutions, and all the problems are because of Benny Gantz and whatever, or the public will see it differently, because polls show that the number one issue today, for the first time, is not security. It's economy and management. People in Israel, all the polls show want a normal functioning government. And the question is, will Netanyahu be able to get away with saying, I can give you a normal functioning government. Look, I brought you vaccinations. I brought you all these good 10 years that we had. It's because of my partners. Or will his partners remind that we got to the elections because he couldn't keep up to his words to Benny Gantz, because he couldn't think of the idea that he wouldn't stay prime minister and therefore broke away from this deal. I said in a studio that in a way, Prime Minister Netanyahu, which I have to tell you, I think is, has done a lot of good things for Israel, right? I'm not an anti-Bibi in that sense, but I think in the end of the day, I like to look at politics from the personal, because I deal with politicians, so it's a lot about their personality. So I think in a sense, Netanyahu is the scorpion, is that in the pond, and he had a very easy frog on his back. I mean, he couldn't have found a better partner than Benny Gantz to go along in this partnership, and even him, he had to sting. And now we're all drowning in another round of elections. But at the end of the day, it's a very different round of elections. Because of the parties from the right threatening Prime Minister Netanyahu. B, because we are going through an election in a pandemic, which is, like a big world war for us, and it's not working. He could have done it when we went in March. It was the beginning. Now we're a year after the pandemic, and the government has nothing to offer to the public because the lockdowns are not working. Vaccines are not working as fast as expected. So we'll have to see how Prime Minister Netanyahu deals with the pandemic.
We have two more questions before we wrap up. There's a growing resentment, some may even say animosity, towards the Haredi community for their conduct during the crisis, the pandemic. Do you think that it will push more Israeli to cast an anti-Haredi vote? And what will it do to the already polarized Israeli society?
Something about the coronavirus, Israel always had this, Israelis in Israel had this, this belief that when we're faced with a crisis, we know how to unite, because the enemy was from the outside. It was, a military threat, and the enemies were outside. So it was very easy to unite as a community against the threat coming from the outside. This time we're faced with this, virus. And instead of being united, it's tearing us apart. Now, I think it's happening in a way or another around the world, but I can tell you about Israel. So we're faced with this threat, which is a war, but it's dividing us apart. And all of a sudden, this coronavirus is like a mirror, and it's showing us all the cracks and the hardship of Israel's society. Look, anyone who knows how to read demographics and numbers and sees what's happening understood that actually in Israel, there are two Israels. You know, we all talk about two states for two-state solution, right? We are in fact two states. There's this Western modern economy, the startup nation, you know, Weiss and Checkpoint and whatever. And there is a third world economy and a third world population living within Israel. And they're the Haredi, which by choice of their leadership are left behind on education, on work, on democratic values. Okay, you have to understand that today, as we speak in first grade Israel, there are 24% Haredi first graders. Now, the majority of them, because of their rabbis and because of the leadership, are not learning math. They're not learning English. They're not learning social studies. They're not getting tools that will allow them to participate in the modern country by choice. 24% of first graders in Israel. So, and then you have, as we speak now, in first grade, about 24% of Arabs in first grade. Now, the Arab population is, you know, more than ever wants to integrate and more than ever wants to go for higher education and understands that their mobility is through education. But because of other political reasons, has not been funded or has not been pushed into the center as much as the other population. So, I mean, if you look at the Bedouins in the south of Israel, they are no means what you would think about a modern country, okay? The way they live and the way that they educate, not, okay? So this pandemic, in a way, is making Israel try to struggle with these two countries. Now, on the one hand, we have the best health system and the fact that Israel has, you know, healthcare for everyone. There isn't a single Israeli that doesn't have access to healthcare and has a very good healthcare. And the fact that in hospitals, you meet the Israeli startup spirit. You know, it's interesting. A lot of physicians in Israel, when they were first faced with the coronavirus, didn't wait for, you know, studies to come out. They experimented on the move with whatever they had and managed to have protocols which saved a lot of lives. But on the other hand, you have the Haredi community saying, I'm sorry, we understand your democratic values, but we believe that going to school, going to funerals, having weddings is more important than anything else, and we're not going to listen to you. So indeed, the sentiment of anti-Haredi and political issues is going to be Lieberman picked it off the ground because he understands that's how he's going to get his 7 or 8 seats. But it's much deeper. Israel has to face reality and say, can we go on with a situation where we have a quarter of our students not studying what they need and not being able to participate in the workforce and still stay a vibrant democracy? I was very privileged to be on the President Rivlin's steering committee to come up with a new Israeli story, because when we looked at the numbers a couple of years ago, President Rivlin talked about the 4 tribes.
Right.
He talked about the 5th tribes in the territories, and he said, look, we have to come up with a new story because we don't even, I mean, the old Zionist story is not relevant for half of the population. So my take was, and I'm happy that it was, we talk about now a startup nation for all its citizens. Okay, we always talk about startup nation, and then we say, oh, for those who enjoy it. And when you talk about a startup nation for all its citizens, you talk about equality, not something that a majority gives to a minority, because there's not a majority anymore, but it's a mutual interest. And I think the biggest issue that the next government will have to tackle is how do they integrate everyone in, despite the fact of their religious belief or their patriotic sentiment, and make sure that they stay on board. And I think Netanyahu, because he needs 61 votes, not for the country, but for his personal reasons for the trial, will have a hard time, as he has now, going to his ultra-Orthodox partners and say, enough is enough, this is a pandemic. You cannot keep your schools open. You cannot have these huge funerals. We have to do what this night. You cannot go on not teaching your kids what they need to know. And he won't be able to do that. And that would be Israel's tragedy.
Okay. You mentioned in passing a two-state solution. I just want to alert everybody that tomorrow at 3 p.m. We host experts of the RAND Corporation releasing for the first time the findings of a research on the two-state solution. Is it still relevant, or other options are more dominant, like one state or confederation, or maintaining the status quo? But in the coming election, this awesome issue is not on the table at all.
Naftali Bennett himself said, and that's the reason he started with 20 seats. He said, look, it's not time to talk about the territories. It's not time to talk about settlements. It's not time to talk about one state or two state. We'll put that aside. Let's just talk about health, economy, social issues, coronavirus. And once he said that, he got his seats. If he would go back to that issue, he wouldn't get those seats. I don't think it's on the table now because two things. You know, the status quo for most of the Israelis is sustainable. Reality is we live this way, so there's not a sense of urgency. There's another immediate fact. And I think that under the Trump administration, the Palestinians were A, back to the wall, and B, gave the Israelis the sense that they would say no matter what, so that they're still not perceived as a partner. And I think, to be honest, it's transitional times, A, in the region, B, with the Palestinian leadership, because there's going to be a transition sometime in the near future. And we have to see what the Biden administration will do now. So I think it's not, for the first time, it's really not an issue.
Okay, two quick last questions, and I appreciate brief responses. One is, what is your assessment of the protest? It's been going for a while, very persistent. What kind of impact it had on the political scene?
I think it had a lot of impact in the summer. It managed to annoy Prime Minister Netanyahu in a way, and it helped in a way for this political turmoil for the blue and white to feel that they can't go on sitting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. But now I think it's become almost irrelevant because of the elections. But protests are always important.
Okay.
One side or another, because they cause the sentimental involvement. And the thing is that at the end of the day, it didn't emerge into a very strong political body that would take that energy and bring it to the ballot. So in that sense, it didn't succeed because of all of the ego-driven male politicians who thought they could start their own party and found out that they had no one behind them, but by doing so, managed to disrupt any possibility of taking the energy of the protests into a political body.
You gave me a perfect clue to the last question when you said the male ego-driven or whatever. Last but not least, how about women in politics? We all been raving about the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
I think this pandemic has proven that women leadership and women management is something of great value. I'm a very keen advocate for women management, and I think women leadership is different than male leadership. I don't want to go into details, but I really believe that the sense of being very focused on the target, working without ego, working with leadership, working very to the point is something that we see in this pandemic, and the women leaders have prevailed over male leaders in dealing with this. And unfortunately, also because we have a lot of, because of the generals who are now leaving the scene, but took a lot of space from other women. I hope that Tony Blair was right when he said 20 years ago, or 15, yeah, I think 20 years when he wrote, yeah, oh wow, 20 years, that the 22nd century would be, no, we're 21st century, sorry, would be the century of the women. And I want to leave you with something that former president, our late president Shimon Peres used to say. It was interesting, when he was prime minister, he only had men around him. They were called the Blazers, and he was very unpopular. And when he became president, he changed his cabinet, and the people around him were very strong women who led all the operation, and he became very popular. And he started to talk a lot about feminism and about women's rights. And he used to say two things. He said, a room without women is a room without future. So I think I agree with him on that. And the second thing he would say, I remember I met him just a couple of weeks before he passed away. And he said, you know, Donna, I would talk to him a lot about the Middle East, his vision. And he said, you know what, I didn't understand. I didn't understand how important it was women's rights. And I think that once we see women's right in the Middle East, we will see peace in the Middle East. So I think, unfortunately, in Israel, we have two parties, religious parties, who don't allow women to run in there. It's appalling. And I think we will understand that women leadership is something of value. And at the end of the day, the generals have fallen apart, and professional politicians have fallen apart. And we will take the reign, and I think things will be better. But hopefully, we'll see more women. It is a big problem.
On this happy note, Dana Weiss, I want to thank you very much for a candid talk and excellent analysis. Thank you all for being with us today. I'd like to thank my JPC able colleagues, Talia Dekel and Rachel Exil, for facilitating this webinar. Stay tuned to our next event tomorrow at 3 p.m. with the experts of RAND Corporation on the two-state solution. You need to register first to attend. Thank you all. Stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you. Nice day. Stay safe.
We hope you enjoyed that briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. If you did, like the video and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our future content.